research has shown that you're 4 times more likely to be shot while carrying a weapon than not carrying a weapon. And in cases where you have a chance to resist, you're actually 5 times more likely.
Even if more people die, it's still worth it.
I personally would consider that a wild take. Assault weapons and mass shootings makes mass shootings more fatal. It's every 10% in gun ownership that goes up. 27% increase in the youth suicide. You're gonna get really anxious in a public situation and start blasting. I think the case for strict gun control is pretty clearly laid out in the data, and the logic can be extrapolated from a really simple hypothetical. If we had no guns, we would have no gun crime. From this, I think you can understand that less guns would equal less gun crime, which is also shown in the fact that the 5 states with the highest gun death rates have high rates of gun ownership, and the 5 states with the lowest gun death rate have gun ownership percentages around 15%, which is far and below states like Montana, for instance, 65% gun ownership, 6th highest gun death rate, or Mississippi has the highest rate of gun death and 54% gun ownership. Another statistically consistent point you can find is that stricter gun laws equal less gun deaths, and there's not really existing data on the fact of less gun laws or relaxed gun laws leading to less gun deaths. Another measure that I wholeheartedly support that we'll be discussing here today is the banning, or at least strict regulation in the way we do say bazookas, of assault weapons, as data shows that assault weapons and mass shootings makes mass shootings more fatal, more casualties, and there is also strong evidence, or at least some supporting evidence, of assault weapon bans lowering the overall instances of mass shootings as well. I think a common refrain that you hear, or like kind of rebound talking point from like the pro 2A side, is something along the lines of, well, what about things like alcohol or cars? When I don't think these things are necessarily analogous, given that before you drive, for instance, you have a test to take, you have classes for some people, there's 6 months of guided driving only, and then before getting your license, you also pass a performance test to be able to drive. And when you can drive, you're told where to drive, which way to drive, what speed to drive, while most pro-gun people want untrained, unskilled people to be able to own any guns in any way or however they want. I think as a society, we should have 2 goals. That is deciding the value versus the risk of things that we want to allow, meaning if something is valuable enough to enough people for the risk of harm it could create, then we decide how to allow it. Like cars, for instance, enough people get value from cars that we see it worth the risk of the possible deaths that cars could cause, but we still take every precaution to control who and how we drive. And I think you have to be pretty bad faith to say that driving would be safer without these precautions. And I don't think the same can be said for guns in terms of value versus risk. And I often find a lot of people on the pro-gun side are unable to even answer the question of how many innocent kids' lives, how many innocent people's lives are worth their ability to own a cool gun. The other purpose of the 2 that I'm speaking to in society is to legislate laws that limit harm as much as we can, which is I'm ready to demonstrate today by pretty much all metrics, data, numbers, historical precedents. Limiting the access to firearms is the only surefire way to do that, as allowing more guns opens the door to more chaos and more harm. But I'll end my opening there, and you can feel free to give yours.
Okay, sure. So basically, I've personally experienced a lot of incompetence with gun control in the form of background checks. I've been falsely denied on more than one occasion. Working at an FFL selling guns, as a certified firearms instructor, was denied then. As an FFL, as a gun salesman, I've run background checks on police, and likewise, they've routinely come up as a denial. So from my anecdotal experience, there's a lot of false positive background checks, and by extension, gun controls being ineffective due to them just being incompetent in their application. So, I mean, I guess you could argue, in theory, you could agree to gun controls as in specific ideas, like you should be able to limit dangerous people from having weapons or whatever. But ultimately, if the gun control is inept, then why would you support inept gun control?
Cool. Was that like all that you had? I didn't want to jump in and interrupt you.
Yeah, I was going to keep it brief, and then I like
Man of
trying to keep more specific context with individual arguments
yeah,
together.
you're a man of many words, definitely, right?
Oh yes, oh yes.
Yeah, so there's just, I guess, 2 points that I want to start with. One, to find a point of agreement, but first I did want to ask about something you said in terms of personally being denied background checks despite being, like, you know your way around guns, your job and things like that. Probably you shouldn't have been denied. Do you think that more harm is caused by like people who should be accepted being denied, like yourself, or do you think more harm would be caused if someone who definitely shouldn't have a gun is allowed to get a gun?
Well, it's not just um, a false denial. There are false approvals too. Like say the shooter with the 1911 that went into the church and killed a bunch of people with that. He had a felony conviction for it was drug related,
Hmm.
which technically should have prevented him, but he was approved anyway. Um, I believe that guy's name was Dylan Roof. And that's, both sides of the coin, false denial, false approvals still happen. And, that was more harm than, because the government approved him. He was a convicted felon and they approved him anyway.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I get that definitely with the false approvals. I mean, that like I to that point, I mean, I think that laws should be as effective as they can be. My I guess only point of contention is I don't think that like the shortcomings of laws that are like that can be proven at least through like empirical evidence, whatever data, statistics can be shown to have benefits. I don't think the shortcomings are enough to do away with them. Like the kind of analogy I would draw there is like the speed limit. Like some people still do speed, but I think we would all agree that having a speed limit saves lives still. So like the fact that some people are still going to speed isn't enough to like do away with speed limits.
well, there's degrees of speeding. I think literally everybody speeds. If you're one over the posted limit, you are speeding. So I mean, everybody speeds. I don't think there's anybody who doesn't speed at some point.
Sure,
It's
but if
just a
you
matter of
think like,
degree.
well, I guess the point is, do you think that there would be more harm caused without speed limits than having them? I think at least if you're going to speed, like you said, most people are going to try to be close enough to where they could slow down if they need to. Like maybe you're going to go over, but you're going to go like 3 over, right? So if you're going 63 as opposed to no speed limit and you're going 90, I think that it would be clear to see that like speed limits lead to more positive outcomes. And I think the same could be said about background checks to kind of draw the connection.
I would actually disagree with the speed limit argument just because, like your father or your mother taught you how to drive, right? You go through your permitting process, learner's permit, and they show you how to drive, how they drive. And even if you didn't have a speed limit, I think people would still come to recognize that, hey, I need following distance in order to stop. Otherwise, I'm going to wreck. Even and the speed limit doesn't prevent that safety cushion you would otherwise get if you did drive slower relative to the speed of the person ahead of you. So even if you didn't have a speed limit, I don't think you would necessarily have more or less.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I disagree. Obviously, not a speed limit debate. We don't have to go in circles about the benefits seen in speed limits. I do think though, like seeing as like I mean, people are going to speed with the speed limit, go a couple over. I think without having that kind of barrier there, that people would be pushing it further and further, which would lead to more dangerous outcomes. What the other point I wanted to draw or ask, I guess, to see if there was any points of agreement, I guess, before we butted heads for however long or whatever. Is there any gun, and I think I asked you this on Discord. I don't remember what you said. I don't remember if I asked you, but are there any like gun control laws, any type of preventative measures that you do agree with, or do you think that there should be blanket none, like guns can be given by anyone in any way? Like what is your perspective in terms of gun control?
So I actually agree with red flag laws with the express condition um, that your legal standard of when the gun is taken is still completely in line with the process. That's saying you have your ability to um, attend your own hearing to defend yourself. It shouldn't be to the civil standard of so under a civil standard, you can't have a public defender. It's completely 100% out of pocket. If it was the criminal standard of due process, then you could be assigned a public defender if you were broke, and actually be able to defend yourself in court. Um, have your publicly appointed, like if they were going to throw like a mental eval at you, you could have a third party option of, okay, I want a third party mental eval. I don't want, it's basically like getting a doctor's second opinion. You
Mhm.
know, one person could say, well, I didn't like what he said when I asked this question, and so on and so on. And so it reduces the odds of a red flag law taking the guns from the wrong person.
So with like extreme risk laws, red flag laws, whatever they want to be called, I think there's some semantic differences with them. I'm more familiar with like the extreme risk side of them. So do you agree with like with extreme risk laws? I think like in Florida has them. I have it listed here. A couple states have it. California has it. Do you agree with like if family members are reporting that they think this person is a danger, like if it's a kid in school, if school officials are reporting this kid is a person in danger, do you agree with like guns being removed from the home in that instance?
Again, it would have to follow the standard of due process. You're going to have to get that person that you're trying to confiscate the guns from into a court hearing so they can have a day in court to defend themselves.
And you want to support removing the gun until the court proceeding is over?
Correct. I would not support that.
See, I think that would lead, obviously, you're just giving person more time. And then also, if it is someone who did want to do something horrendous, God forbid, obviously, but did want to do something horrendous with that gun, and then they have a scheduled court proceeding like 2 weeks out, and they know, okay, after this day, I might lose my gun. I think if anything, you're just giving that person a timetable to carry out what they were going to do. How would you kind of contend with that?
Well, it would that would require that person to know that they are on notice uh, under the requirements of an ERPO. Um, and another problem with that is Florida, I believe, had a Baker Act where people can be committed, which would have prevented, I believe, it's Parkland, I think.
Mhm.
Um, the government knew that that shooter was mutilating animals and doing all this behavior that really hints at violent, unstable behavior, and yet nothing was done.
Right, but then I guess under what you're proposing here, the only change would be that person would be given a court date and they would be able to keep their gun. Wouldn't that, I just like, and I guess that my problem with that is if like in the Parkland instance, this person's doing all these things, obviously he wants to carry out a shooting because he did. You then give him a court date for however long out. I mean, I think that he's just gonna be like, okay, now I have to do this before then. If anything, it's gonna push them to be more likely to do it than anything else.
Well, they'd also be watched too. I mean, you could actually assign resources to watch them. So let's say, oh, I see this person loading a whole bunch of guns up in the back of the car and a bunch of ammo canisters and some body armor and a helmet and whatever else. And they could halt the shooter right then and there, you know, even if they did have a court date.
What about that is more pragmatic, like having to dedicate this amount of resources, officers' times, money, whatever it would cost to watching someone, which I mean, obviously could have downstream effects of like crime happening elsewhere with less resources available and those kinds of things. What makes that more pragmatic than, okay, we're just going to remove the gun, even if you're going to give them a court case, we're going to remove the gun from your home until your court case. And if you're found to not, violate or whatever the terminology would be, we'll give it back. Kind of like a better safe
because
than sorry type of deal.
if your rights are purely down to subjective standards, then you don't really have any rights. You don't like if the government had to give you permission, to have criticism of the government, let's say, then you really don't have First Amendment. Same thing with the Second Amendment.
Right. And I mean, I guess I get the slippery slope argument. I do think it's different when we're talking about like things that are specifically made to kill people and danger that is imposed, like could be imposed on others, rather than like criticizing the government isn't going to like lead to someone dying, right? If you're like walking around, I think that, and I'm pretty sure there's pretty strong judicial precedents as well about like being allowed to limit guns from people if it's going to present terror to people. Like I think it's like as goes laws or something like that. I have it here. Hold on.
It's laws related to, say, domestic violence restraining order. where that's to a civil standard, and I don't support those either. I think it should be the
It's
same
going,
criminal standards.
yeah, it's going armed laws, which is it prohibits the carrying of weapons that terrify the public or like for people who like if we're being felons, things like that, might terrify the public to have guns, right? And so there is judicial precedence there. And I think that like if you're a possible like someone who could possibly fall under an ERPO, I think that would allow enough precedence for the government to step in. And I don't know how much your quote unquote rights are being limited there, especially when we're talking about ensuring more rights for others in terms of like freedom and safety and these kinds of things. Like the reason laws like this exist in the first place.
True. I mean, it ultimately comes down to, do you think um, should false prosecutions be more or less common, even at the expense of potentially losing more people? And I think I fall on the other side of that. I think it's well worth it, even if more people die, it's still worth it just to protect the people who are legitimately innocent.
Yeah, I mean, I personally would consider that a wild take personally. But I guess I mean logically consistent, I guess. I do think that, like I said in my opening, I think that the one of the purposes of a society in terms of like government, in terms of legislating, should be to limit harm. And I think especially when we're not talking about actual like prosecutions, like it's not like I'm saying make this person a felon. It's just like remove the gun from a home that could possibly be a threat. I think that I would fall on the side of even if this person ends up not being a threat, it's safer to remove the gun from their home until we know at the cost of saving more lives. I think that is always a just trade to me. But we don't have to go too much in circles. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add about them.
No, it's still the basic concept of attempting to prosecute or treat someone criminally who shouldn't. You know,
Sure, I don't know if technically it would be criminally because it wouldn't be giving you a charge if you violate an ERPO. I guess maybe you could say like some of their civic rights are being like impeded upon or something like that. But I don't know if I would call it criminal. I did have like I because you asked, I know you were asking about policies and things like that when we were talking on Discord. So I listed like the policies that I would support. Some of them I pretty much would support like the laws in California to the most part being applied federally. But I did want to go through for at least a little bit of this and like see which ones you agree with and which ones you don't agree with, the kind of just points of agreement versus points of disagreement. And I'm sure we could have some back and forth about it. The first one is permit to purchase. Do you think that is a just law, and then why or why not?
so one bit of context for a permit to purchase
Mhm,
would be the New Zealand, the mosque shooter, right?
mhm,
That guy was a permitted gun owner. He had a permit to purchase. Um, he, he specifically circumvented a lot of those laws aimed at reducing, um, people like him should have been restricted ownership, but
mhm,
he got around one restriction that required two character witnesses by just simply hiring people via, I think it was like Craigslist or something similar,
mhm.
just an online, and then had them call the authorities. And they went, oh yeah, you could trust him. He hadn't said anything crazy. Oh, you know.
Yeah.
So, he circumvented that pretty, pretty hilariously easily as a character witness. And any character witness related permit requirement, could easily be circumvented by that.
So I
It
feel like
doesn't.
just quickly to interject, I feel like that is more of an argument for like stronger or more efficient laws rather than doing away with the law as a whole, wouldn't it be?
How would you make the permit to purchase stronger than character witness registration? Um, they even had a ban on high cap mags, and you use high cap mags.
Well,
Um,
one thing I would propose would be like some sort of like a psychiatric exam, like a mental health evaluation. I know
he, he
like
he passed he passed a mental eval.
Okay, yeah. See, I don't know like the specifics with that case. I just know in a lot of like, because I'm not as familiar like with foreign laws than domestic ones. I know in a lot of states currently, even where there are permit to purchases laws, there's not like not all of them require like psychiatric evaluations. I think that like even de-escalation classes. I think that there's measures that could be implemented to make them more efficient. And then also when you see somebody when you implement a law for the first time, there's obviously going to be ways around it. And I think once you implement something and you see the loopholes someone can find, it's just about going through and patching those up to the best of the ability that you can.
Uh, I would disagree with the efficiency aspect of mental evals regarding firearms, because what do you like? Which specific statuses lead to violent instability, or what increases the odds of them going out and committing a shooting? Like there's no, and then yeah, I mean, like how do you do that? Like
Yeah,
how do you determine that?
I personally would be fine with pretty much anything on the DSM-5, I would say. Obviously I don't know like offhand. Maybe there's one or two that arbitrarily would not be like enough to like, restrict or whatever. But anything on the DSM-5, at least that shows like unstable emotions, that being like depression, anxiety. For instance, and like I told you this in Discord, like I own a gun, right? I also have like really severe generalized anxiety. Uh, I don't think people like me should be able to get a gun as easy as I got a gun. So it's like things like that. I think it pretty much the DSM-5 as a qualifying standard would be a good starting place, and then you could work from there for like subjective cases.
So okay, so like going back to the part of the Discord argument about
Mhm.
the STM5 and what do you call it? Clinical depression,
Yeah.
I think. It was like 8% of Americans with that, which is like 21 million. And even if you had like half of Americans as part of that group being gun owners, that would that would make 4% of the total American population as prohibited possessors overnight. Like, how do you go about confiscating 4% of Americans that own guns? Like, how do you?
Yeah, yeah, and kind of like how I said to you, not about this topic specifically, but in the discourse, I don't think that like erasing harm or to the point you're trying to make, I don't think there's any 100% surefire way. Like let's say it's what 4%. I don't think there's a way to get the entire 4% to turn over your guns. But I do think that if you implement measures like for instance, I guess like buybacks, things like this, even just laws that say like with strict punishment that if you have these guns and you fall under like you're one of this 4% of the population, like there's going to be fines or criminal time, whatever. I do think that a majority of people would see that as enough to give up their guns. And I think that that moves us towards the right direction. I don't, to the point you're trying to make, I don't think there's a way to 100% get 4% of the population. But if you're getting 60% of that, I think that that's better than 0%, right?
Uh, yes and no, because this is based off of just clinical depression, which I don't think necessarily makes you uh, the type of person to go come at a mass shooting. You get sad, you get distracted, you get frantic when thinking about certain things in certain situations. I
You're also a lot more emotionally unstable. And I do think also when we talk to like gun violence, I do think that like suicide is an important facet to consider. And I do think that it would definitely help lower firearm suicide rates, especially if you're looking at like youth, right? I know that I think it's every 10% in gun ownership that goes up, 27% increase in the youth suicide rate, which the overwhelmingly used suicide is done by firearm. I think it's 90% of them. So I think that there's a lot to speak to depression specifically about suicides. And then when you get to like anxiety, if you get anxieties, you can fluctuate emotions really easily. So like, who's to say you're not going to get really anxious in a public situation and start blasting or get angry really easy, start blasting these kinds of things. I think it's more about limiting harm, and I think that just because you can't do 100% doesn't mean that 40% even isn't better than 0%.
Right, but I'd have to go back to this is based off of clinical depression only,
Mhm.
and that doesn't that's it's kind of like like you know that movie Minority Report, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to minority report a crime, which may or may not happen, you know.
Mhm.
Um, you're effectively, I mean, you're trying to treat someone as a criminal without proof, basically. You're
Yeah.
you have an intent or a concept that yeah they might become violent, but they haven't, and that gets into some really dark authoritarian things possibly. Um,
I don't know. I don't know if I would agree with that. I think that the basis of most of our laws are predicated on the assumption that if we don't have these laws, some people would do some really bad things. And I think that justifies most laws. Like I know we disagree about speeding, but like the first one that comes to mind is speeding, right? Like people would do, I think the idea of speeding is that a lot of people would speed and it would lead to like a lot more even I don't want to say like crimes necessarily, but like if we're talking about like homicide from like hitting someone with a car or like causing car crashes, those things would accelerate. So that's why we did speeding. I think if you look at like alcohol, even some alcohols are taken off the market because of the presumption of what could happen if they were on the market. I think that that's the basis of most of our laws. And I would say, sure, the government can be inherently authoritarian in some places, but I think in most places, most people agree that laws lead to better outcomes.
Question: do you
Yeah.
trust the police?
Do I trust the police? I think
Yeah.
no and yes. I mean, it depends on like the situation, right? I don't want the police going to handle like a domestic dispute, right? But I trust the police if there's like an active shooter.
I generally don't trust the police. I don't think anybody generally trusts the
Yeah, see,
police.
I think we'd have more agreement there than disagreements. I don't trust them for a slew of things, a large slew of things.
Um, but like, so what do you do in the moment, say, um, in terms of like a home invasion?
I think the safest thing you can do in a home invasion is try to leave, right? Or try to get out and escape. I think that escalating to violence yourself or bringing a gun in the situation of a home invasion only increases the likelihood that someone dies. This is statistically shown as well. Uh, uh, and you're just rolling the dice on who that's going to be, right? So the smartest thing to do would be to get out of your home.
Abandon your home that you've worked hard for, um, because someone else thinks that they're entitled to your stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of like that versus like you and your whole family potentially dying, I'd say yes. But then it's also not like, we don't live in like the Wild West, right? Like if you leave your home, it's not like it's just that guy's home now. You can just like call 911. You can take the measures you want. Like if we're talking about bring it like somebody steps in your home, right? Somebody invades your home. If we're talking about the chances being pull out a gun and 50-50 you're going to die or lose your new 50-inch TV, I think it's smarter to lose your new 50-inch TV.
I am highly skeptical on the 50-50 figure of you dying if
Well,
you
to
pull a
be clear,
gun.
that's just that's not statistically proven. But what I can say is that research has shown that you're 4 times more likely to be shot while carrying a weapon than not carrying a weapon. And in cases where you have a chance to resist, you're actually 5 times more likely.
According to who?
According to hold on, I mean I have the study linked here. I can pull up who did the study real quick.
And also that leaving your home thing is dependent on if the suspects allow you to leave or you have the opportunity to.
Yeah, so this is like
So
it's a NIH published study, PubMed Central, done by Charles Brones. I mean, it's 5 people on the study, published on NIH, and it says specifically. Let me scroll back down to where it is. They took uh, they took 3,200 individuals who were victims of gun assault, randomly took 680 cases from that, and they found through the 680 cases they looked at that you were actually 4.2, 3 times more likely to be fatally shot while carrying a gun. And then specifically in the assaults where the victim had some chance to resist, like knew the attack was coming and could have used their firearm, it actually went up to 5.45, so over 1% higher.
how did, I mean, if you compare that to the number of DDUs, like gun defense uses, it was a study that was the result of Obama era ordered study on gun violence.
Mhm.
They found, I believe it was 500K to 2 million self-defense gun uses. The overwhelming majority being they brandished the gun, not a shot fired, and the crime halted as a result.
Yeah, there's also like I have a 2019 report here from VPC, and it's for in 2019, obviously, so a little bit dated or whatever, but the odds of justifiable homicides, so like somebody using a gun in self-defense versus criminal homicide, somebody using a gun in assault, is there's about one justifiable homicide for every 30 criminal homicides, and about 1% of all homicides are the justifiable ones. So like good guy with gun killing bad guy with gun is actually far less likely than bad guy with gun killing good guy with gun.
I would agree with that, um, because that those DGUs are predicated on the fact that overwhelmingly you are not firing a shot in
Mhm.
defense. You're saying stop what you're doing and leave, or I will kill you.
Yeah, but
You
then
know,
I mean, even then you got to think like if you have a gun, yeah, I mean that's it makes sense because that person's gonna be a lot more likely to like, okay, I have to shoot you now than if you don't have a gun, like the person's gonna be less likely, like they're gonna feel less threatened, and when you feel threatened, you're gonna have more of a chance to like, an animal backed into a corner type mentality.
and then there's also other things like maybe then they didn't go in there to take your TV. There's been more than one instance I can remember of people going in there just to do heinous things. I'm not going to specifically say.
Right. Yeah. No, to be clear, I do think that like self-defense is justified, right? Like I think that if someone is intending to do harm to you, that like I guess quote unquote, I don't know if I would say like if harm is the right word there, but like, using a measure like firing a gun or whatever, if somebody's intending to do harm to you, I think that's justified. I have no problem with self-defense. I just think I do have a problem with even as like the victim, quote unquote, I guess not quote unquote, but victim of a crime, I think you being the one to escalate it to violence is typically just going to lead to more bad outcomes than positive ones. So it probably should be avoided.
I mean, for the statistic of justifiable homicide versus criminal murder,
Mhm.
even in the instances where you use a gun that's more rare than simply brandishing, you are not killing the person. You're using lethal force. You accept the fact that you could potentially kill someone shooting them in defense, but
Mhm.
overwhelmingly they don't die. You call an ambulance, and then if you hit them, even if you do hit them in a critical area, tourniquets can be applied, compression bandages, chest seals,
Mhm.
stuff like that can be used, and overwhelmingly people survive a gunshot wound regarding a handgun.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, my contention wouldn't be, I guess, harm done to like the perpetrator or whatever. I just think that you're making it a lot more risky for yourself, and especially if you could think like to extrapolate that to like, let's say it's somebody coming into a home where like you have children, right, and your wife, and like your children are in their own room. I think it's going to be demonstrably more dangerous for your children to like open up a firefight in your living room when they're one room over than it would be to like not escalate it to that level.
I mean, even if let's just grant, like, I don't know if it is true. I haven't seen the study or not. Let's just grant 100%. Let's say it's just true, right?
Mm,
That it is more dangerous by default. You know,
yeah.
shouldn't it be up to the people living in the home to make that determination? Like in that moment, would you rather roll the dice or just give up and just hope they don't do anything to you?
For me personally, like my moral compass, I think it kind of depends on the situation, right? Like I said, I'm fine with self-defense laws. So I think like in a situation, if somebody comes in your home with a gun, and you don't know what they're gonna do, I'm not gonna like degrade you or judge you for using a firearm, right? I'm just trying to say is that it's probably safer for you to not. Now, that being said, if it's a situation where somebody's breaking into your home and they don't have a gun, and you still, and then you then, or like they don't have a weapon, right? Don't have any type of like lethal weapon, and you open fire and shoot them, then I do think that there is some culpability that can be taken. And I also think that like the alternate side of that logic could lead to some like dangerous things, right? Like, what if it's just like a kid, right? Like a hungry homeless kid breaks into your house and it's like stealing food, and someone comes and just like blasts them, right? I would consider that probably murder, right? I don't think trespassing begets violence in itself, but to the point you're trying to make, I think if someone has a gun or even a knife, like a weapon that where they could escalate violence, I do think it probably should be in your choice. I just think that the smarter option would be to not escalate in any situation.
That requires hindsight. You already know that it's a starving team or whatever.
Well,
In the middle
what
of the night,
what
you're not going to know.
what would your opinion be like just in the hypothetical? Like, let's say maybe you saw them through the window walking up to your house, so they don't have a weapon. Do you still think it's justified to fire on that person? If they like break after they break into your house, they're in your house, but you like saw them before, so like that they don't have a gun. You went and grabbed your gun. They break in. Are you justified to shoot that person?
Just as a personal opinion note, or what legally
Yeah,
is.
your personal opinion.
How big are they?
I mean, I guess good question, right? Like it's fair enough. Like let's just say they're average size, right? I don't know I don't know, like the average man's what, like 6 feet, 170, 180, right? Like average sized male.
I think I'd issue them a warning, only one, and if they didn't obey it, then I would shoot them. Yeah.
Hmm. Even so, even without them like advancing on you, like let's say you give them a warning.
Wait. I thought you said breaking into the house.
Well, yeah, no, I mean like they're in your house. I just mean like you walk down the stairs, they're in the kitchen, right? You issue them the warning. They just turn and look at you like shocked, right? They don't come at you, but they also don't move. Are you still shooting? Is what I mean. Like they don't advance on you once you give them the warning.
I'm holding my sights on their chest until they leave.
Yeah.
If they don't, they're going to get shot. Yeah.
Right. And I think instances like again, I'm not that against self-defense, right? I am sympathetic to some arguments. Like again, I'm not pushing for like a blanket ban of all guns. And like that situation, I think that would be understandable. What I don't think would be understandable is like stand your ground laws, like the shoot first laws, like right, the extent that these laws
What do
can
you
get
mean?
into. What'd you say?
Standard ground. Could you define standard ground? What the legal requirement is?
Ooh,
Because I believe the requirement is you have to justify and articulate. I mean, that's how it is here in Tennessee.
I think in
So
Indiana, and don't quote me because like I could be wrong here. I think in Indiana that like trespassing, or I actually might be thinking of what's it called, the Castle Doctrine, like in Florida. So it might be a different law, but to my knowledge, or at least what I was referencing there, and could be wrong again, was where trespassing is enough justification. And it could be the Castle Doctrine when I think about it.
it's not trespassing in no state nationally is by itself just trespassing is not a legal standard for you. You would get charged with murder 100%. That is nowhere near. Castle Doctrine deals with um, you have evidence of breaking and entering in a livable structure. So they broke it. If they broke into an unconnected, oh, that can't even talk anymore,
Mhm.
unconnected garage, you couldn't shoot them. That wouldn't satisfy Castle Doctrine at
So
all.
I just looked this up again, not that familiar on it. But in Indiana, it says that it is for people to defend themselves or their property, if they break into your home. So again, my interpretation of what this means, and even if it's not it, I do think like laws are to be interpreted, right? So like the way people could interpret it easy, because it's the way that I do, is that if someone breaks into your home and then you feel that like your property is in danger, like they could steal something from you, then you have the right to use force.
Well, not well. Castle Doctrine. If you have evidence of them breaking into a livable structure, like
Like your
like it
home.
holds a bedroom or and stuff like that, not just a shack out back or whatever.
Right.
If
But I
they
mean,
break
I'm just
into
applying it to like the hypothetical of like someone in your house, right? Like you could just
yeah,
blast them not
but
having a weapon.
but Castle Doctrine in itself, it doesn't matter what weapon they had or did not have. If they break into a livable structure, by default, you can shoot them. You can use lethal force.
Yeah.
No, 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 nothing else is required.
And that's something that I personally highly disagree with. I do think, again, granted, like you said, hindsight is going to be 2020, right? When you're in the moment, it shouldn't be. But that's why also I think that like there should be a lot more training that goes into guns. I don't know how you feel about like mandatory training for guns, but I think like not only on how to use a gun, like even having to fire a gun in a non-lethal way, but I think that like de-escalation courses would be huge to like limiting these kinds of things, because what we end up with a lot is that people who are unskilled or untrained with guns, they don't have like the benefit of being a professional. They just go and buy a gun and then they end up in a situation like this and they're scared. And I mean, you see this with cops even a lot too, right? Where cops are like, I shot him because I was scared. Well, like, how often do you think this happens to normal people who aren't even cops, where they own a gun and like a situation like this happens? Maybe just some poor, dumb kid breaks in their house trying to steal some food. And because they're fearing for their life, they just end up shooting someone that they could have just, like you said, given a warning, and maybe they just scurried off, right? And I do think that things like training, de-escalation trainings could go a long way in preventing these kinds of circumstances from happening, because I think in a lot of situations, guns are used where they aren't really needed.
I think there's about 3 points need to be addressed.
Yeah, go
The
ahead.
first one is um, like the training requirement thing. Who pays for that? Um, if it's a mandatory requirement before you can take possession, before you complete a transfer, that is going to pretty much make ownership significantly more expensive. You know, so if you go take, say, a sheriff regional training center approved handgun carry permit course, that's about $300.
Mhm. So I
So a
guess just
gun,
to clarify that before you move on to the next point, I'm fine with that being like paid for by the state. I'm fine with it being funded through some sort of tax. I'm fine with it, which I know you're a conservative, so you probably hear the word tax and want to throw up in your mouth, but bear with me. I'm fine with this being like publicly funded in some way. So like you're not having to come out of pocket $300. Whatever would make it the most feasible.
and then you have the problem of, do you enforce that retroactively? Do you go back and say, well, all your gun owners now have to go get some type of mandated training, which is traceable, trackable? You have to have a piece of paper that says you did it or whatever.
So to
Then
that
you
to that
have,
point, before you get to the third one, I would be fine with like training having to be like renewed, like right, like I work with kids, so I have to get first aid trained, right, and I have to like renew my first aid training every other year. I think it is, it might be every year. I don't even remember anymore, but you have to get it renewed. So I'm fine with like gun training working the same way, and then anyone who didn't have to get it just retroactively whenever it would be for their next cycle, get in there.
and then you have the problem of, do you have training specific to weapon type, caliber? Because guns do operate differently. There's different manual of arms per different type.
Mhm.
That would increase the cost as well, potentially. What, how many hours do you allocate for that to pass the requirement? What's the marksmanship requirement? And then even then, if it's lower, or if it's higher than annually, 50 rounds, that's a better requirement than most police get as their annual qual.
Yeah, well, and we see how that goes for police. I think police need more training too. That's a different debate, but you don't trust police either, so we probably agree to some extent on that. For me, I think that it's more the situational training, right? Like I don't care about people being like badasses with guns where they can like take it apart and put it back apart with a blindfold on and load within 10 seconds, right? I think like situational training, like knowing how to handle yourself. Um, like say in a break-in, right? Or say in a confrontation, if two people are arguing, like, hey, just because somebody like somebody's like running their mouth and yelling at you or whatever, you don't need to pull out a gun and blast them in the chest, right? Things like that, and how to de-escalate a situation without your gun. I think that these could go a long way without even having to get into like firearm specific trainings.
I kind of approached funny anecdotal story. I had an argument with some random passerby. I was going to my car at work, and he was going off about random stuff I didn't even understand. And he basically called me out for carrying a gun and all that. I was basically okay. So I go back into work. I had them secure my pistol. I go, fine. We'll slap box. We'll slap the ever living shit out of each other. Fine. Let's go. And that problem went away.
And see, if more people handled problems like that, I think America would be a better place, right? That's exactly right. You don't need the de-escalation training. And that's another, and this is like, aside from like statistical points, I think a lot of people get guns because they have fucking tiny dicks, so to speak. They're scared to throw hands. So they get guns. So when a confrontation happens, they can be like, well, I have a gun. And it just spirals, right? To like worse and worse outcomes.
I have a big truck also. It has big knobby tires, and I never ever take it off road. It never gets dirty. It's always
Exactly.
shiny.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's just like, who's got the bigger dick here, right? Who's got more ammo in their firearms? And it's just a lot of just things that it's like, I don't know, man. Like, I just think that a lot of people don't really have that kind of like emotional intelligence to understand, like, I can calm myself down here without killing somebody.
You definitely do have instances of that. I mean, you can go on YouTube and find probably hundreds of videos dealing with that alone. But I think you can find infinitely more just legitimate defenses of with guns.
So
Um,
what, because you spoke to the price of training. So I'm interested, what price do you think is worth? Like, let's say that hypothetically speaking, of course, which I did have like, there's like some data of like training leading to like, or removing training for like concealed carry leading to higher rates of assault. But let's just say like a hypothetical where we knew for a fact that this kind of training reduced the amount of gun violence. Is there a price where you would say this is fine? Like you said, $300 or whatever. Would that, to you, do you think that would be justified to mandate, or would cost outweigh, like the potential of saving some, arbitrary amount of lives?
I would, you'd have to weigh it overall in terms of restrictions and what those restrictions actually grant you.
Hmm.
Like say, uh, armed guards, their qual is like 50 rounds, dominant hand, non-dominant hand, both hand. They don't even draw from a holster. It's kind of pathetic, just like the police qual.
Hmm.
But if your requirements exceed that of both of those things, what extra ability should they gain from it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I get that. I do want to go and talk at least a little bit about assault weapons. I know we kind of been going on just about like laws and stuff, which I think is like important to the discussion as well. I do know we have like, because we spoke a little bit on Discord or whatever, we do have like disagreements about the assault weapons as well. Did you just want to kind of lay out what your perspective is with assault weapons, the problem you think with banning, regulating, whatever word you want to use against them, and that, so we can maybe dive into there a little bit before we end?
Sure. I think assault weapon is a garbage term most of the time. Most of the time, they say, "Oh, it's assault weapon," and then they point to like an SKS rifle, and you go, "Well, that's not an assault weapon." It's
So
just
how
like
how would you define an assault weapon?
I don't think such a term exists.
Okay.
It's a term solely to make people who don't have a clue about guns think that this thing is evil. That's all it is.
I see, I would disagree. I think that it's like it's a label, and I mean labels are like descriptive, right? Like they're all created, like they're social constructs to get into, I guess, the psychology of them or whatever, sociology of them. Like labels don't exist until they do, right? And I think that assault weapons is kind of just like a catch-all term so people can understand like these type of weapons are more dangerous. For me personally, like I agree with the way that it was defined sort of in like the 94 assault weapon ban, right? The way that they defined it, I think was really good. I think even better if you look, there's 9 states that ban assault weapons. I think more if you even more so if you look to states like California, Connecticut, I think that they even do like a better job defining them with how they lay it out. And then obviously there's a list. I'm assuming you're at least somewhat familiar with the 94 weapons ban. I'm sure you know like how they lay it out and like, you know, the different qualifications. I have it here if you wanted me to read through it, but I do think kind of giving like a definition and then like, hey, these are the specifications that it would need. I think that that is suffice enough to call it a legitimate label. No.
Well, the purpose of the label is what? You're generally referencing assault weapons in terms of criminality. So what assault weapon features assist in that criminality? Some of it include like one of the features would be a collapsible stock. How does that how does that help you perpetrate the crime? It doesn't. It adjusts your length of pull, and that's all it does. Like,
Stocks and again, like I told you on Discord, admittedly, when we get into like more of like the different technical pieces, I kind of am not as knowledgeable. Stocks, though, I do believe serve the purpose of like aiding your accuracy, right? By keeping the gun a bit more stable, doesn't it?
right, but wouldn't
So
you want
then,
that to
so then it would
be
let you like carrying out like a mass shooting or something. I think you could pretty easily extrapolate how it's going to help you hit targets more, things like that. I think the better definitions have to do with like high capacity magazines. I think that for me personally, like in all honesty, I think even banning high capacity magazines or restricting them would do a lot more than just like the blanket catch all term of assault weapons. I do think that like when you say assault weapons, it kind of gets into like a semantic disagreement where like, you know, people like you are going to say not even a word, you can't even define it. To your point, right? A lot of people who say assault weapons can't define it, don't even know, like they couldn't point it to rifles and say, this is an assault weapon and this isn't, right? I do agree with that much, but I do think that there's utility in a lot of the things that they go to ban are things that should be banned, in my opinion, right? Like I know in the 94 weapons ban for rifles to be considered like a semi-automatic rifle be considered an assault weapon. One of the things was like a grenade launcher, right? I'm completely fine with a grenade launcher being banned. I think a rifle with the collapsible stock, I do think that there's probably something to say there about how it could aid you and being more fatal in a shooting. And then, yeah, like high capacity magazines, I think is the most important, which in the 94 band wasn't in, but in like California and Connecticut, they do have high capacity magazine as one of the qualifications.
yeah. Like if you discarded like because you think high capacity magazines is a legitimate thing to go after, take that away from the assault weapons ban. What do you have?
Take,
You
wait,
have
sorry, what do you mean? Take it like out of the assault weapons ban where it's
Yeah,
not there
like
anymore?
what like we'll just set that aside as a legitimate argument for later.
Mhm.
But what else part of the assault weapons ban would be effective in addressing the criminality you want to target?
So
Like, what
again,
does
this
a
would it kind of gets into like the differences between like California's and the 94 one, where like I I I'm somewhere in between the two of them, but like I know in California, like rate of fire is something that is added in. A lot of like the other cosmetic parts of it, like I said, a grenade launcher. I'm perfectly fine with guns that come with like the grenade launcher, Call of Duty fucking mod on it. I'm fine with that being banned, things like that, because I think you can. I mean, anyone in good faith could admit, like, yeah, if somebody's gonna go in a school and shoot the school, if they had a grenade launcher, a lot more people are gonna die, right?
well, yes and no, because a legitimate grenade launcher is already pretty much regulated under the NFA. It's an NFA item, like a suppressor, a machine gun,
Mhm.
short-barreled rifle, short-barrel shotgun, any other weapon, destructive devices. It's regulated the same. So people are not the reason they put grenade launcher, quote unquote, in the assault weapons ban is because you had the ability to launch rifle grenades from an SKS,
Mhm.
which one that's just a taper mount on the barrel. That's not an actual tube that you put grenades in to fire. That has nothing, no reasonable relationship to you actually being able to deploy a grenade at
Mm.
all. And grenades are NFA items anyway. So you're, you know, same requirements as a suppressor, if not worse.
Are suppressors currently regulated through the NFA where like they're, you know,
Yes.
all but banned?
Mhm.
Okay.
Well, no, they're owned in tens of millions now.
Mm.
It's been exponentially increasing the ownership of NFA items.
Right. And those, to my knowledge, again, NFA for most of them, I'm sure there's maybe some where you can still get on. You either have to like be a manufacturer, like a seller of them, or it can be passed down. Like they grandfathered in people from before, like the second part of it was made in like the 70s or 80s, right? And if you own some of this before then, you got grandfathered into being allowed, and now they can be passed down through families, right? Is that how most people gain ownership of them?
So if you, I believe you're referring to the Hughes Amendment on machine guns.
Yes.
So any individual, any person, you, me, anybody except a felon or someone who has served 1 year in prison, which is the equivalent of a felony,
Hmm.
can possess a pre-banned machine gun in most states, unless you have a state prohibition. So you would go find your pre-ban date of manufacture or transfer of, or, I'm sorry, not transfer, date of importation of 86.
Hmm.
So you could get like a pre-ban M16 that's legitimately burst fire full auto. But you would have to pay $200 registration. You go through the transfer, and the ATF conducts the background check, and not the FBI or a state branch of the FBI.
Okay, yeah, yeah. See, so what I was referring to, because I had it here, I knew I did somewhere. The GCA, is it the Gun Control Act in 1968 or something like that?
Yeah,
So then I guess, yeah, so the mistake I was making was it's not you had to own the gun before then, it's the gun had to be like manufactured
made
before then.
made or imported.
Okay. Okay, yeah. So I think if anything, I think that just adds more utility to some of the things that are in the like in an assault weapons ban. Again, I know because for me, like I'm not like I don't fully I think the 94 assault weapon ban left too many loopholes, left a lot to be desired from how it didn't retroactively ban guns, anything like that. It was only guns from after when it was implemented and things. So when I look to like the guidelines of what I would want implemented on a federal level, I kind of look to some of the different states as well. And again, I know like in California, like rate of fire, high capacity, like we're taking high capacity magazines out, but like these kinds of things are implemented in those as well, where I think that that would have a lot more like utility then if people are still able to get guns that have this kind of rate of fire that are only going to enable them to do more damage in mass shootings, then limiting that would be better. And I mean, you can see from, I mean, there's loads of studies that show assault weapons make mass shootings more fatal. There's not as much supporting evidence that banning assault weapons drastically will reduce the amount of mass shootings. There's some, but there's also like conflicting data as well. So that's not as much of a point that I would want to drive home. But there is tons of strong supporting evidence that mass shootings, when they do happen, are more fatal when there's an assault weapon included.
I would counter that with it's not necessarily about the status of being an assault weapon, quote unquote. It overwhelmingly deals in the caliber of the gun used, which nobody's shooting up a school with like a ghetto ass Tech 9 9mm anymore. I mean,
Mm.
there's lots of mass shooting committed with handguns, but they're technically not considered assault weapons. And the ban targeted Tech 9s because the mag well was for the pistol grip thing you hold. So uh, it's more about caliber and scoring a critical hit with that caliber.
Right. So I guess the points that I would want to bring up is, and these studies that I'm going to quote here are talking about assault weapons as they were defined in the 94 ban. Um, from 81 to 2017, 86% of fatalities were accounted by from assault weapons. Multi-person shootings, which is just a shooting with more than 4 people who were killed within 24 hours. Assault weapons lead to, on average, 2.3 times more people killed and 22 times more people wounded than those done without an assault weapon. So it's just the totality of damage you can do with an assault weapon, which I think that, like, if we're being like logically honest, right, it's pretty easy to see how more bullets in a magazine, faster rate of fire, these things are going to allow you to do more damage. And it seems to be bared out in data as well, right? And also the 5 deadliest shootings since 2010 involved weapons that would have been classified as assault weapons. And I think if you go from 2009 to 2022, it's like 9 of the 10 deadliest shootings have been done with these kinds of weapons.
The overwhelming majority of mass shootings defined as 4 or more shot in a public place are committed with handguns, not long guns of any kind.
Well, yeah, no, and that's why I was saying, I don't care too much to drive home that point, but in terms of totality of damage, right? If you're looking at the deadliest mass shootings, they're overwhelmingly committed by guns that would be qualified as assault weapons. So, like, to the point that I brought up in the beginning, I don't think erasing harm, right? I don't think there's a way to get to no guns, no gun crime, right? That's just impossible, especially with the culture in America. But I do think there's ways to limit that harm, right? And if one type of weapon is disproportionately represented in the deadliest mass shootings, I do think there's something we can do about that.
Why? I mean, that damage is not inherent to assault weapons. That damage is inherent to probably capacity and caliber. You don't necessarily need an assault weapon to get the same results. So
Right.
say you have an AR-15. Let's say you pick up a Palmetto State Armory off the internet for $500. You
Mhm.
have 30 rounds of 5.56 pistol grip, collapsible stock, a flash hider, bayonet look, potentially a barrel shroud, and potentially a grenade, an ability to mount an M203 grenade launcher. Okay, now you go over to a different site, you order a Mini 14, which is also a 5.56 gun, 30 round mags, no collapsible stock, a flash hider, but not technically an assault weapon under the federal definition. You have the same you have the same caliber, you have the same rate of fire, it's not an assault weapon though. It's
Mhm.
the same caliber, can do the same damage.
Well, by the federal ban, in like most of the states, I know California, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York come to mind. Those 4 I know for sure include capacity of magazines. California has it at like 10. I think it's 10 in Connecticut too. Don't quote me there, but like the California is the one I'm the most read up on, right? And I know in California they classify high capacity as low as 10, which I could see that being a little low, right? I know like a lot of pistols have at least 10 or more, I'm sure. I think mine has like 12. I don't know for sure exactly, right? I'm not like a huge gun guy or whatever. But is there, like, if we're taking the definition that includes rate of fire and high capacity magazines, is there a quote unquote assault weapon that you know of that wouldn't fit under that definition? Or like, I guess, so to speak, is there a weapon that otherwise would be considered an assault weapon, but doesn't have the rate of fire or the magazine capacity? Because if we're talking about my definition personally, I would be going with one that would include both rate of fire and the capacity of the magazine. Because I do think those are the most important when we're having this discussion.
Could you shoot me a link for the California law that has something to do with rate of fire, how they define it? Because I
Yeah.
think, I mean, it overwhelmingly deals with semi-auto. So, I mean, you have a mechanical limit of rate of fire depending on magazine size, the limit of the person, the shooter. So I'm not sure how they define.
So what California does is they ban weapons by name on the justification of the rate of fire. I don't know if I just have the law here. I don't know if I can send this through the chat. Tell me if you can see this. Did like a chat pop up for you?
oag.ca.gov, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, it's literally just like the California thing. And then I have a couple different links. That one's just straight for, I guess it's like the most reliable source because it's straight from California. But when I was reading about it, what they said was that they have the different qualifications for assault weapon, capacity of magazine, the threaded barrel, hand grips, launchers, whatever, all that kind of stuff. I'm sure pretty similar to the federal ban. And then they banned weapons specifically on the name, like by name. And then they also banned copying models of those, like possible hybrid models, due to like rate of fire in the weapons, like AK-47s, Uzis, Galils are on the list. Bunch of guns I've never heard of before, honestly, are on the list.
Well, even I see a couple of guns on this quote unquote assault weapon list that wouldn't even match their own definition of assault weapon. Like a MAS 223 doesn't have a pistol grip, doesn't have a flash hider. It wouldn't be an assault weapon under their own claim of, so I
Well, I guess
find
technically it would be. I mean, it's kind of circular, I guess, but they name
it
it
doesn't have
here,
a
so it
pistol
would
grip.
be
It
right.
doesn't have a thumb hole stock. It
Well, yeah,
doesn't
but
have a
it's
holding.
so like, and I do like I get what you're saying, right? But I guess just to be semantically annoying, I think it's these guns by name or any gun with these qualifications, right? So I do think like technically speaking, they would qualify, but I get what you're saying in terms of like the logistics of like they don't meet the qualifications for like other guns. I know for a lot of them, again, like when I was reading, which I have like a lot of links here. I could try to find the one when I was reading a lot of the reasoning of why they like the weapons they listed by name were because of things like rate of fire, and then also like I think it was the AK-47 specifically. Like there's a lot of like hybrid, I believe, weapons. I don't know exactly what that would mean, but like copycat kind of weapons, right? To where they didn't know if they could pin it down enough just by listing like the qualifications of it. Because, and I know this was a problem in the 94 weapons ban, where they would like limit all these things. They had all these things limited, and then manufacturers would just come out with like new, really similar types of weapons that could just like slip through the loopholes.
Well, the manufacturers would just read the qualifications of what an assault weapon is and just go, oh, these are features that are not required to operate the gun. So we'll just delete those
Yeah,
off the gun and sell it anyway. It's no longer an assault weapon. Like
yeah. So and
that's my point. You can do the same damage without an assault weapon because you still have the same caliber, you still have roughly the same stability with just a conventional rifle stock as you would a collapsible.
right, and I think that's the
Um,
utility of California naming some by name is like the ability to do that. And then for me personally, that's what I think is the utility in banning like, or I guess having high capacity magazines in the band, because I do think to what you're saying, I think a lot of the cosmetic stuff, I, I'd have to go through them one by one. I'm sure some of them I could care less if they were banned or not, but I just think that for me, high capacity magazine is the biggest thing. I think rate of fire is up there. Caliber, somewhat caliber with capacity of magazine, maybe not caliber alone, right? Like I'm fine with I don't know, higher caliber pistols, even though like even then, I don't know, like calibers is a tricky one because of, like you can put like you said, you can put different kinds of calibers and different kinds of guns, just as long as the gun, can hold the caliber or whatever. But like you can theoretically just make like doesn't like a Desert Eagle take like 50 cals?
that's a 50 caliber Action Express, and it's not the same caliber as say a 50 Browning.
Okay.
Um, and also there's no rate of fire restriction in this law either that I've seen.
Yeah, well, no. Like I said, I guess, yeah, to what you're saying, they don't list it as a qualification. They banned certain guns, added them on the list because of the rate of fire. Like with the Uzi, the Galil,
But those are all
AK-47.
semi-auto. They wouldn't be selective fire. They wouldn't be something that you could increase the rate of fire. They're all semi-auto.
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, I might be mistaken then. That's what I want to find which one it was. That's what I was under the presumption of. I guess then, I mean, just I mean, I would support rate of fire then, regardless of if it's in California specifically. Like if we're talking about my qualifications, that would be something that I would want included. I thought that California had that included. Again, if I was wrong, then my apologies. But
You
yeah, I
pro
was
you
under the
probably
assumption.
read
What do you say?
you probably read a proposed bill. I
Mm,
think I've seen something relatively the same where they tried to target binary triggers and tried to ban it via rate of fire, but you can't really ban rate of fire because it's dependent on magazine size, shooter's ability to work the trigger, and the mechanical limitations of the action.
Do you think that America would be safer if we had more of these kinds of weapons or less of these kinds of weapons? Just as like a hypothetical. Let's say on one extreme, everybody has one of these. On the other extreme, nobody has one of these, right? Which tilting towards which way do you think America is safer?
I think obviously I think the results would probably be middling. It'd probably be the same. It'd be no different.
You think that we would
Wouldn't
have,
reduce them, wouldn't make it worse.
right?
Because if, let's say, because an assault weapon is basically a handgun with a pistol grip and a stock,
Hmm.
bigger, a little bit bigger caliber if you're talking about rifle, and bigger caliber if you're talking about assault shotgun. Um, but otherwise, most handguns are semi-auto. AR-15s, most of what people own are semi-auto.
So you think that if there were more of these, that there would be equal rates of crime than if there were less?
Roughly the same. It would fluctuate just like it does now, up and down.
Why
But
do you think then that the states that have higher rates of gun ownership tend to have higher rates of gun violence?
because they're typically poor, like the South in particular is notorious for taking the most federal dollars. I mean, there's heinous poverty in those places, and when you have a population density and um, poverty, then you have violence because then you have people high on something, then that influences how you think. And when you see a bunch of dash cams or police videos or shootings and stuff, like, oh, this guy's like, oh, da, 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 oh, cocaine, oh, da, 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 fentanyl, oh, da, 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 meth, oh, da, 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 whatever it is. Except weed. I don't give a shit about weed.
Yeah.
um, um, but somebody's usually high on something. They may or may not have a gang affiliation, and in order to become part of the gang, you do have initiation rights. You do have to go out and commit a crime, which helps push that violence higher and higher.
So do you think that guns around areas of crime are generally a bad thing or a good thing? Do you think that it enables worse crime?
I mean, they'll get them regardless. You have Chicago, a lot of those guns that are used are banned. A lot of those people are already, like, if you look at crime reports for Chicago area, it is true that they are trafficked from out
Yeah,
of
I was about
state.
to say Illinois is like the highest recipient of guns through the iron pipeline. Like most guns in committed in crime, not most, but a disproportionate amount of guns used in crimes in Illinois are from traffic from other states. Of those states, there's like the top 10 all have rather relaxed gun laws. I know at least I know 8 of them have like no background checks, that type of thing. And they're trafficked into Illinois. And Illinois is a victim of that. And I think in a lot of times they end up getting a lot of bad wind because of that. Granted, some of their cities are more susceptible to crime because of things like income inequality and that kind of stuff, which begets crime more so than guns even. But I think that for me, I think that if you know an area is more susceptible to crime, obviously allowing more guns or having more guns in that area is going to be a bad thing because crime to me, right, is a factor of two main things, right? That being opportunity and then poverty or income inequality, however you want to sum that up. You need both like the struggle and the desperation that poverty creates and then the opportunity to commit a crime. And you have umpteen times more opportunity to commit crime when you're armed. So I think like to your point of like these states with higher gun ownership being poorer leads to more crime. I would say that's even more justification for stronger gun restrictions, less gun ownership in those states.
You have a higher rate of gun violence in Chicago, though. It was illegal to transfer those guns into Chicago. So let's say you go out of state. Overwhelmingly, the guns used in those crimes are handguns. Federally speaking, regardless if you deal with an FFL, a gun dealer, or a private sale in a state where it's legal, You cannot transfer a handgun to a non-resident of your state. That is illegal federally. So no matter how you go about it, you go to an FFL or private sale, it's illegal federally.
Right. Well, I think if you're going to commit a crime with a gun, you're not really going to care about breaking the transferring law or whatever. But again, like we said, a lot of the gun rates that happen in cities like Chicago, these cities in Illinois, are from states with more relaxed gun laws. So people aren't they're not buying the guns in Illinois, right? They're buying the guns in like I don't remember. I think like Arkansas is one of the higher states for it. A lot of, like you said, the southern states, they're buying them in these states with really relaxed gun laws, and then they're taking them to Illinois. New York is another high recipient of this, and then they're committing crimes with those guns.
Right. The so a problem I see with that is what do you actually do about it? State legislatures can, you know,
Well, you don't have
decide for
states with
themselves.
relaxed gun laws, right? For me, it would be having the blanket same amount of gun laws across all the states, right? I don't think you should be able to, especially when there's clear evidence of people going to these states with relaxed gun laws, buying a gun and taking them to these other states. I don't think you should be able to have like a state like Arkansas with like practically no gun laws
Uh, a lot of those people are repeat offenders, right?
for the
You
iron
know,
pipeline specifically, or
for Chicago or firearms crimes in general.
I don't know that. I want to know that off top. I wouldn't say that's too far-fetched to be true though. I could believe that, yeah. If
Like
you know that to be true, then I would believe it, yeah.
like they already have a privileged status. Another way they get guns is just theft. Even if you limit it to say you ban high cap mags, you're limited to a 10-round gun, right?
Mhm.
Let's say, okay. I mean, if we're talking about mass shootings are still possible. 10-round limitation on a handgun. You do it in public, you shoot four people, that's a mass shooting.
Right,
You know,
but damage will be limited, right? Which I think is important because there's not a way to get, again, there's not a way to get rid of mass shootings, as horrendous as that is, but there is a way to limit the damage that can be caused from them.
uh,
Right?
I
Like
mean that
you would agree if you have a gun that without reloading can shoot 30 bullets, you have an easier time at least. You would grant the time is it's an easier time for you to kill more people than if you can only shoot 8 and then you have to reload, right?
I would say that depends on the venue. So, for example, if you are going to an environment where targets are not exactly target rich and they have the ability to defend themselves, you're going to have a significantly harder time trying to run up the scoreboard as a mass shooter, right? Even
Right,
if
but
you
no,
did
but
have,
but see, I feel like that's kind of missing the point because it's like you have to apply the two in the same scenario. So even in that scenario you just gave, would you say it would be easier for the person who has 30 rounds without reloading to kill more people than the person who has 8 rounds and then has to reload? Like who has the easier or the better chance to kill more people? If you had like, who would you say?
that assumes that those people cannot get high cap mags. I mean,
What people? I'm sorry.
the people intending to commit the shooting or the crime or whatever.
Well, I'm just saying, like in the hypothetical, right, where it's you put a different shooter in the same situation. One has a magazine that can hold 30 rounds, one has a magazine that can hold 8 rounds, right? Which one in the same situation has a better chance to kill more people?
It does require both, but I would agree that it would be more dangerous. You could potentially have more damage, but it requires both the ability to restrict that, which like the number of guns in this country is like 415 million, and the number of high cap mags are many times those figures. So you're not going to be able to really restrict high cap mags in any meaningful way because they're already entirely proliferated. I'll have to steal the statement from Ted Nugent. If you can
Mhm.
ban guns, I'll ban water.
Yeah, so
I think it holds true.
I think there's like a good logical path you can extrapolate from that. Like, let's say there's 450 million high capacity magazines, right? I think that it would be pretty logically clear that less crimes would be committed with high capacity magazines if there were only 200 million high capacity magazines, right? There would be less available to commit the crimes. So then less would happen. So then, like, again, if you ban them, yeah, you might not be able to get 452 million of them away, but getting half of them away is going to have better outcomes than getting none of them away.
I would, I mean, you're probably not going to get half. You probably wouldn't get half even in
Well,
20 years.
getting 10% away would be better than getting zero away, right?
I'll help illustrate it with the Australian gun confiscation.
Mhm.
Would you say generally Australians were for the ban, right?
I mean, I know of the ban. I don't know like what the feelings are like. I don't know if it was like a popular when it was passed or not, anything like that.
And initially it was Australians issuing death threats to Howard that proposed them, and
Mhm.
then later on, according to many different reports, they were hailing it and they wanted it, they accepted it. But even under the Australian example, you didn't have people complying with the law as a majority, even with amnesties years later, and even the Australians that did not comply with the buybacks as a majority. There was still 2/3 of the estimated firearms via ban status. Like if you lacked a permit, you were not willing to go get a permit and registration and go through all the hoops to own that legally. That would be part of the illegal market.
Mhm.
2/3 of those are still unaccounted for in
Well,
Australia.
I would just go back to again, I think that 1/3 is better than none, right? It gets you closer to where you want to be. And then I also think, again, there's more measures you could take, right? Like, let's say somebody commits a crime with a gun or commits a violent crime, either you could add a provision that, okay, well, we're allowed to see if you have one of these, right? Like there's extra steps you could take. You could even look at the Australian example and see maybe where some of their shortcomings came from and then try to build on that. Like the first application of any law isn't going to be as good as like once you have precedents to work off of. But yeah, I would just go back to even if it's only 1/3, like 1/3 gone is better than none gone.
Yeah, but I would, I would put in perspective how willing an American gunner is going to be versus an Australian gunner. I don't think you're going to get a third of banned mags or banned guns off the street. I don't think people would comply to that level.
I think it varies. I mean, either way, it's rather like subjective to let on. I could in some instances agree with you. In some states, I'm sure it would be lower than 1/3, right? Like Texas, I'm sure you're not getting a ton of guns out of Texas. And Indiana, where I'm from, I'm sure you're not getting a lot of guns out of Indiana. But I'm sure like New York, California. Well, California wouldn't have them already anyway, but and I'm sure New York wouldn't either. But in like there's regions where you could get even more than 1/3, right? And
Yeah, I agree.
so
But
it's just, I don't know. It's about limiting harm for me.
I would say the majority of states would be less compliant as opposed to more compliant. Um, and also another thing with that is you have police departments going on television stating, we're not going to comply with the confiscation. We will not be enforcing this. Even if they pass it, we will not enforce it. So even if they said, okay, all your 30 round PMags, they're now illegal. Felony to possess, transfer, blah, 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 manufacture, blah, 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 import, blah, 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 whatever. They wouldn't enforce them.
Well, a lot of people threaten things. I think it's different when it's an application, and this is to both of those points, right? I think that if police stations knew that there were going to be penalties, maybe they lose funding, maybe there's legal things that can happen to them if they don't comply with enforcing these. I think the overwhelming majority of the police officers threatening to not enforce it would. And the same with people, right? There's plenty of people who would say, well, they're not going to take my guns and this and that, right? But when you're looking down the barrel of like 20 years in prison and you have a family, right? I think that that's going to move like a lot more people. Like who's going to risk it, right? Let's say you have a family, right? You're one of these people with this guns that should be confiscated. You have a kid, like your kid goes out and gets in trouble. The cops have to come to your house. The cops see the gun, and now you're going to jail for 20 years, right? I think that that kind of fear would move a lot of people to be like, okay, it's not really worth it for me. Granted, to your point, yeah, there's still is going to be people who's going to be like, fuck the government and all that and another. But I do think that once it's like something's a reality, the kind of like gung ho attitude that people pretend to have isn't as for on the forefront.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely a bunch of shit talkers, let's
Yeah.
say. Um, but
Like shit,
still,
if Indiana told me, I wouldn't just give up my gun for no reason. But if Indiana told me like, hey, like if you have a pistol that has more than 10 rounds, you could go to jail for 5 years. I'm gonna be the first one, right? I'm gonna be like, here, bro, take it. I don't want it anyway.
like, and another problem would be people were like, the cops were like, I think it was the bald black dude in Texas said one of the PDs, he's just like, yeah, I have to look out for my officers, their safety, blah blah blah, and you have you have signed on blood oath 3%ers, that literally swear by blood to do that. Uh, and some of them actually do have criminal records. Some of them are part of the military. Some of them are part of the
Mhm.
police. Some of them,
Yeah.
So it's hard to judge, but I think if you compared it to the Australian example, it doesn't hold a candle to the amount of compliance that you would see
Well,
here.
I agree, and that's why, like, you hear a lot of people. I mean, I don't know if like people you've talked to, but I've heard a lot of people in spaces that will say things like, "Well, we could just have the cops go gun door to door and search the homes for guns and these kinds of things." And I think that that would lead to like horrendous outcomes. One, because it's kind of like Gestapo-esque, you know what I mean? And I know you'll disagree with this, but it reminds me a lot of what Trump says he wants to do with ICE with illegal immigrants, having them go door to door and shit. And it's like, that kind of sounds like the Gestapo to me, right? I would say the same for firearms, right? Like if we're going door to door, and then also, yeah, like cops are going to get fired on by a decent amount of people, more people than we should allow. And I wouldn't say to do that. I would say to like more let it happen naturally, right? One, have the first initial load from people who just don't want to, not comply with the law out of like fear of the repercussions they're going to give them up. And then it's just like, yeah, like if someone commits a crime, boom, you find the gun. If there's a domestic dispute, cops end up coming to the house, they see the gun, boom. And I just think over time that it will just erode away from that number. And even if it's baby steps are better than no steps.
Well, how would that, like, if you had an assault weapon ban, then you would also have to go confiscate NFA items then, because those NFA items are assault weapons. They're registered.
NFA items meaning like,
Short barrel shotgun, short barrel rifles, machine guns, belt fed
yeah,
M249.
yeah, like I said, for
So
me, it would be, I don't know how much I would want to enforce through like, we're gonna go and confiscate these because I think that that would just lead to a lot of negative outcomes. For me, it would be like buybacks, penalties for people if like if the gun's registered. Obviously, there could even be like you could enact like harsh tax penalties to incentivize people to hand them over. Like I think there's tons of things you could do without having to like door to door knock and get them that could like consistently erode away from the number. Obviously, especially in America, there's not going to be a snap your finger and all these guns are gone way to do it. But I do think that moving towards that is the right way to go rather than staying where we are. And like we've seen what the effects of that are, or as some people on the 2A side want, to move further away from that and have less gun laws and have more guns. Like I've spoken to 2A people who will, which you by and far don't seem as what I would call far gone as these people, but they will like
oh,
by
what are you talking about? I'm an amosexual, bro. Like, I would have no problem if they deleted the NFA in its majority.
so okay,
I
but then I guess fairness, then I would ask you, do you think that anybody should be able to own any arm, like any gun, right? Like in this, obviously, when we're talking about arms, like, do you think someone should be able to like drive a tank around? Do you think that rocket launchers should be able to be bought?
functional tanks are already legal. They're already legal right now, currently.
Right. I don't think that private citizens, I think that isn't it like I'm pretty sure like a company or something can own a tank, but I don't think a
Nope.
private
Mm-mm.
citizen can just buy like a tank that will fire on people.
So two ways you can go about it. Um, you get a demilled tank, which doesn't have any functional guns on it, right?
Mhm.
Anybody can own that. A felon can own that. Um, if you're looking for an armed tank, you still have the Hughes Amendment restriction of the selective fire weapons on that tank, or full auto guns on that tank, if you have one mounted.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm
And
talking about like, like traditional tanks. But even like then, like, do you think that like a private citizen should be able to own like a bazooka or like an RPG? Like, I mean, obviously, I'm sure there's like NFA. I think you can. I know, like, I think you can maybe in some way register again. But I'm just talking like, do you think you should be able to walk in a Royal King, same way you buy a handgun, an RPG?
an RPG, like an RPG-7 or like a wall rocket,
But
or
like again, I don't know. Just a rocket launcher, man, like a bazooka.
so if you were, I mean, you couldn't actually do much damage with a bazooka, ironically enough.
So you think people should be able to buy bazookas?
I mean, if we're going to compare damage, it would be less damaging than probably an AR-15, because it's a single shot. There is no area of effect shrapnel. It's not a grenade like you would typically think of it. It's anti-armor, so it focuses a jet of hot air through your armor.
Man, I don't see like okay, so I mean I don't know enough about guns to name them by name, but I'm talking about like the big things you fucking shoot and it goes boom, dude. Like buildings go boom.
I would say if you deleted the NFA to the point where the class 3 weapons were no longer regulated and they were just treated as a conventional armor, I'd be 100% fine with that. That would be machine guns without the NFA. There'd be suppressors, short barrel rifles, less than
So then do you
60
see
inch
like any
caliber.
limitations? What about like I don't know,
Class 4
two?
weapons.
Yeah, what are class 4 weapons?
So class 4 weapons would be legitimate napalm, flamethrower. I don't see any practical use for. They're highly dangerous to operate. They have a high degree of culpability with you being negligent with them. Um, a lot of times they're too old to be even safely used at a range, even if it's like like a wet county when you have any fear of fire. Class 4 weapons, I think, would be a decent line to draw.
Yeah, so I think with all due respect, most people would think that's kind of an insane position to take. I would
I
hope so.
told you, I told you, I was actually right
Yeah,
there.
no, you weren't lying. I was trying to give you too much credit. Look at me right now. I'm kidding. But yeah, no, I think most people could see that like if we let Billy from fucking down the block own a machine gun or an RPG or something like
How do you afford that as Billy though?
I mean, I don't know, man. Elon Musk, right? I wouldn't trust fucking Elon Musk with a fucking RPG.
Elon Musk is cool. What are you talking about?
No, he's fucking not. Which I
He
mean,
sits he sits down and he hits a blunt with Joe Rogan and he just goes, "Yeah, it doesn't affect me. I'm already too weird for it to affect me."
fucking yeah, dude. Elon Musk would fucking commit like mass violence against fucking immigrants or something, dude. But yeah, no.
Ah,
Yeah, no, we have been going for a while though, so I do want to like get to wrapping. If you wanted to go ahead and maybe like give like a last word, maybe sum your position up one more time or something like that, and then I'll go ahead and then we can go ahead and finish.
I think the way to address gun violence would be down to the specific type of gun violence. If, say, you wanted to address suicide, you would have to actually give incentive to people to be checked out mentally and have some type of practical course for treatment. Um, let's say if you wanted to tackle mass shootings in general, you would have to target the drug/gang affiliated type of places where it's kind of debatable whether the DAs just kind of don't prosecute people equally or to a meaningful degree to give them incentive enough not to do those things. Um, uh, for the high profile mass shootings, I think you're always going to have them just because the reasons for those are so varied. You can't really address that with something that wouldn't violate the Constitution, and it'd be really difficult to pass, almost impossible to pass. Um, ATF is tyrants abolish the NFA. Yay!
Yeah, no, good summary. I would just say for my position, I try to follow statistics, I try to follow data, I try to follow precedents. And when you look at the data, when you look at the numbers, there's tons of evidence that show less gun ownership correlates with less gun crime, stricter gun laws correlates to less gun crime. And I think you can see that with anything, right? If you look at any restrictive laws, it typically leads to more people not breaking that restriction. If that restriction is for something that could aid more people, then it's probably a good restriction. Because of that, I would support regulating assault weapons as defined somewhat like in the 94 federal ban, more so how like states do it currently, banning those weapons or just regulating them to the point that we regulate other weapons where it's not common for people to have them. I'm fine with it being pretty hard to get guns, even handguns. I think there should be training, there should be evaluations. I think that these should be things that you do more often than like I said, I'm certified in first aid. I have to go, I don't even remember at this point. I've been certified for like 7 years. I either go every year or every other year. I also have to get certified for my RBT. So, I get them mixed up sometimes, but I don't think that I should be going and renewing my behavioral therapy training more often than somebody with an AR-15 has to renew training for an AR-15. I'm sure a lot of people with AR-15s have never even been trained on how to use an AR-15, right? So for me, I think it's just pragmatic when you look at the outcomes of firearms, when you look at the outcomes of gun laws, that we should probably have more gun laws. And I think it's also kind of logically consistent or obvious to see that if we had no guns, there would be no gun crime. So the closer we get to no guns, the less gun crime there's going to be. And if we're talking about weapons that are made to kill people, you should probably want to be selective on who we have that has those, right? It shouldn't just be any old Joe that has them. For me, a lot of the arguments for keeping them, I feel like aren't really realistic to your respect. I guess I'll call you Bogan. Don't know your name. We'll go by Bogan. You made a lot better arguments than a lot of people make. I think which granted, I also don't know if you might agree with these arguments at the same time, but I don't think like, oh, we have to protect ourselves against the government. Don't think that's a really good argument. I think even talking about I only have this to like defend my home is a good argument. When as we got into, I mean, data shows you're more likely to get shot if you have a gun. Data shows that everyone in your home is actually more likely to get assaulted if you have a weapon in your home. So I am sympathetic to some arguments of having a gun. I do understand the feeling of protection it provides. I think that's the best utility, right? Is if you feel protected, your quality of life is going to be higher. But yeah, I just think we need common sense gun laws when it comes to guns. But yeah, I definitely appreciate you talking with me. I know we went longer than was planned, so I appreciate you staying over and such as well.
No problem, man. If you want to do this again, or if you wanted to dive deeper into the gun issue at an autismic level, uh, I'm probably good for that.
Yeah, I'm down.
Um,
I know there's a lot we didn't touch on. We didn't really touch on machine guns. I know you want to talk about the ATF. We didn't talk about that, so we could run it back a second time.
sure, sounds good.
Awesome, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.